Hey friends, you might know that I'm a big fan of the Checkly CLI and monitoring as code because it allows me to create, update, and control my entire monitoring setup from code. And while I do a lot of React and Next.js work these days, I wondered if it would be possible to automatically detect all the API GET endpoints in a project to then test them in preview, but also then start monitoring them after I deployed to production. And that worked out beautifully. So if you want to know how this works, stick around, let's go. But before we start testing and monitoring our Next.js API endpoints, let me show you what we're dealing with. We're here at Checkly Next API monitoring.vercel.app, which is pretty much the Next.js starter provided by Vercel. And when we now navigate to the /items URL, there's a get endpoint that returns a JSON array, including 2 entries, which are the strings a car and a house. So where's this API endpoint defined? If you have used Next.js, you might know that Next.js relies on file-based routing. So when we're here in the project, we can go into the app directory, and there's an items subdirectory that includes a route.ts file. You can define API endpoints using this file convention route.ts. And when we look into it, we find that this TypeScript file exports a get function that includes our response that we just have seen deployed to Vercel. And that's really the beauty of the framework. You can create new pages, new routes by simply adding new files inside of the app directory or the pages directory, and everything just works automatically. And I'm a big fan of that. So of course, this is now a pretty simple API endpoint that only returns 2 hard-coded string values. But if your application or your site really does some serious stuff in there, like accessing databases or connecting to third-party APIs, you might really want to ensure that this API endpoint works and is up and running. And this is where synthetic monitoring can help you sleep well at night. So I went ahead and I created API monitoring for this particular endpoint. So we're here in the Checkly dashboard, and here you see a check group that is called Checkly Next.js API monitoring. And here we have this API endpoint that is defined at app items route.ts. And now Checkly will check once an hour if this API endpoint is returning a proper 200 status code. How can you create API monitoring with Checkly? When you're in the web app, you can always hit this lovely plus button. You can choose end-to-end monitoring with Chrome. You can choose API checks. So when we click here, you could now define the URL and what you expect this API endpoint to respond. But that's no fun because we want to do things from code so that they can be version controlled and automatically applied in CI/CD. So let's find out how it's done in this project. When we go back to my editor, we will see all the common Next.js files included in the project. It's a JavaScript project, including a package.json, a Next config file, but it's also a Checkly CLI project. So what does that mean? When we inspect the package.json, there is now a Checkly CLI dev dependency that allows me to control and set up my monitoring right from the command line. And I will show you what that means in just a second. Additionally to this added dependency, there's now also a Checkly config file that defines all the general configuration for your API and end-to-end monitoring in the project. So it includes a project name, a logical ID, something like check frequencies from where you want to test and monitor, and which files will be the foundation for your API and end-to-end monitoring. And here we have it defined that the Checkly CLI is looking for monitoring definitions using our Checkly constructs, and we will see what that means in a second, under a __ checks directory, and we're looking for files with the check.ts extension. So when we now navigate into __ checks, there's one file that is called API check.ts. And this file now defines all your Checkly resources. On top, it imports the Checkly constructs for a check group and an API check, and also some utilities for frequency handling and assertions in your API checks. Then it defines a base URL that we will need when we want to test our new API endpoints in Vercel preview environments. And here we have the check group that we've seen in the Checkly web app called Checkly Next.js API monitoring. It defines the locations where we want to monitor this API endpoint from, and that we want to monitor these API endpoints every hour. And here we have this API check that has the name of our API items route.ts file. Remember, we have it right here defining our get endpoint in this route.ts file. Here we have the public URL that is a combination of the base URL and the subpath items. We define that we expect this API endpoint to be a get endpoint, and we want this endpoint to respond with a proper 200 status code. And these are now our monitoring definitions as code. So when we go back to the Checkly web app, this is exactly what we've seen here. And the beauty of the Checkly CLI and monitoring as code now is that I can control my monitoring infrastructure right from the terminal. I can now go to the command line and test if these resources would work as future monitoring by running npx checkly tests. The Checkly CLI now parses the project, and you see here that it detected that we have one API check defined in API check.ts, and it has the name app items route.ts. And as you see, it now passed. This was running in the Checkly infrastructure and is now ready to be deployed as an API monitor. And how could you do that? After a successful Checkly test run, all it takes is to go back to the terminal and say npx checkly deploy. I'm a big fan of the preview flag, so we can now check what it would deploy if we would run deploy. And it confirms we would now deploy one API check with the ID items and one check group with the ID checkly next. So I could now go and I could pretty much just deploy this, and congratulations, we just updated our entire monitoring infrastructure in Checkly. And that's already pretty cool, but there are two things missing that I want to implement now. First, we have here an hard-coded API check, meaning when I add another API get endpoint, I have to adjust this and copy all this code to add also another API endpoint to my monitoring. And then additionally, I don't want to deploy and test my API monitoring by hand. I want to put it into CI/CD and GitHub Actions in this case. And that's what we're going to do now. So let's tweak this hard-coded API check here and use the beautiful programmatic nature of Checkly constructs. As a first step, I will add a little snippet to this check.ts file that now exports a default function, and this signals the Checkly CLI that this check definition file, this check.ts file, now does some asynchronous operations because I want to read the file system. So let me move this existing code that we have here inside of our async function. Here we go. Let's reformat it. And you might have spotted it already. I prepared some helper functions below the Checkly construct usage. Here we have a getAllGetEndpoints function that pretty much parses this entire project for route.ts files. It imports the detected TypeScript files, and then it filters out all these imports for modules that include a get function. Remember, this route.ts here exports a get function. And then we're mapping over all these detected endpoints, and we're returning the file path, which is app/items/route.ts in our case. It slugifies this path so that we can use it as an ID. And then it also defines the public path, because this will be our monitoring target URL. And now that I have this code already, if you want to have a deeper look, don't worry, I will link the GitHub repository below. We can go into our exported default function and we can start tweaking our little new API check constructor. Let's go in and define a new variable that we call endpoints. And here we will now call our getAllGetEndpoints method. And from here on, we can iterate over all these endpoints. We extract the ID, file path, and public path. Remember that we were already reading the file system and crunching this data a little bit. And now we can iterate over these endpoints, and we can call new API check with the ID, file path, and public path. And they are all still assigned to the group that we defined here above. So with that now, we can get rid of this hard-coded API check and we can give it a try. When we head back to the command line and we run npx checkly test again, we should see the same test happening because our project parsing worked. And indeed it does. API items route was still run right now in the Checkly infrastructure. But now we have a dynamic setup. And when we add now a new API endpoint to our Next.js project, it should be automatically detected by the Checkly CLI. So let's have a look. I have the application running here on localhost 3000. And when we go to the /items directory, we see the similar JSON response. And to add another API endpoint, we can go back to the editor, we go into the app directory and we define a new file. Let's call it peopleroute.ts. Let me copy the exported function from here, add it into our new endpoint. And we say the people will be me and you. So we now save this. We should be able to go back to our local application and we now go to the /people endpoint. Here we have our new get endpoint that we could now deploy to Vercel. But before we push our new endpoint, let's go back to the terminal and first of all, see if the Checkly CLI now detects that we just defined a new API endpoint by calling npx checkly test yet another time. And here we go, we have our existing API endpoint that is already deployed and up and running. And we have a failing API check because this endpoint isn't deployed yet. But overall, it now detected that we added a new API endpoint. I think this is pretty sweet. So the last piece missing now is that we integrate the Checkly CLI into CI/CD to automatically test preview deployments on Vercel. And once we deploy to production, we want to call npx checkly deploy to transform our API check test runs into proper API monitoring. So how could we do that? If you have experience with configuring CI/CD systems, you know that it can take quite a while to get it right because you push some changes and then you wait for your CI/CD pipeline to run. I already prepared 2 GitHub actions that will run on pull request, but also on merge on main. And the quickest way now to show you how you can integrate monitoring as code in your preview and production deployments is to open up a pull request and see them run. So let's get back to the terminal a final time. Let's call git status. We have here a new file. We also modified our API check.ts. Let me quickly check out a new branch, which is live recording here right now. Let me add the changes and let me commit these. Git commit. Oops, git commit. Let's call it YOLO because it's just for me. And when we now push this new branch to GitHub, we should be able to open up a new pull request. Here we go. Here we have the live recording branch. We want to make now a pull request. Let's do this. Here we have the changes. Here we made our API check generation dynamic. And here we added our new response JSON. So I think this looks good to go. And let's create this new pull request. Here we have the YOLO commit and some commits that I forgot to push before. And now we have here the Vercel preview deployment action running. And I think we should have a look. If you want to learn how this GitHub action is set up, make sure to check out the linked repository in the description. I will just go over some details here in this GitHub action run. First of all, it does all the normal GitHub action things, but it uses the Vercel CLI to automatically or programmatically trigger production or preview deployments. So we're installing the Vercel CLI, and then we're using the Vercel deploy pre-build command to trigger a new preview environment build. And you see that this is now deploying to a preview environment, and it spits out the new environment URL, which we then parse with some shell magic to pass it over to the checkly test command. So we see here that we define environment URL with the result of the preview deployment from the previous step, and then we're calling npx checkly test with the record flag. Remember when we defined our check definitions? Let's go quickly to our API check.ts file. And here we are overriding the production environment with our preview check run. So this way you can make your test runs configurable depending on your preview environments. And what does this record flag do with the checkly test command? When we now go back to the Checkly web app, we can go to the test sessions. And here we have this Checkly test run that we have executed from our GitHub action. We can look into the results, and when we now drill down a little bit, we see that this now was testing this API endpoint defined at this Vercel preview URL. So whenever something fails in CI/CD, use the record flag to then check later what was going on and what you have to fix. So and with that, let's go back to our GitHub action run. Let's check if it detected all the new routes. So that is correct. We want to monitor now app items route and app people route. So when we now go back to our pull request, we can merge this one. We can deploy to production, which will happen with another GitHub action. And I will fast forward a little bit and show you the GitHub action and the CI/CD runs that happens when we merge to main. And here we are again, deploy to production now succeeded. So let's have a detailed look. This GitHub action now also uses the Vercel CLI with the difference that we're now using Vercel deploy with the --prod flag. And once this deployment is done, we are now not calling npx checkly test, but rather npx checkly deploy preview to see what we want to deploy. So, and here we see that it now creates two API checks, which is app items route and app people route, and deletes an old check that I had from the hard-coded implementation. And then it also updates the Checkly Next group that we had defined in code. So now this is successfully deployed to Checkly after our production deploy, which means when we now go back to the Checkly dashboard here and we now do a refresh, you see that here we now have our two routes defined via file-based routing in Next.js, and they are automatically tested on preview deployments. And then once you deploy to production, they will be transformed to API monitors so that you can always be sure that your API endpoints are up and running in production. And this is only one example where the Checkly CLI and monitoring as code shines. When you head over to the Checkly documentation into the dynamic check creation section, you will find more examples on how you can leverage monitoring as code, the Checkly CLI, JavaScript and TypeScript to create more monitoring resources. So here we have an example that iterates over a JavaScript or TypeScript array to create API checks and start monitoring these. Or if you want to monitor different environments such as preview or production, you can do that quickly with the Checkly CLI too. And all you need is to write some programmatic JavaScript or TypeScript code to define your monitoring infrastructure. And I think this flexibility is a pretty sweet deal when you want to monitor your project. So this turned out to be a rather lengthy video. Let's recap what we achieved. First of all, we now parsed this Next.js project to automatically detect all the API endpoints that support the get method. And we're automatically testing and monitoring these once they are deployed to production. Additionally, I quickly showed you how you can leverage the Vercel CLI in combination with the Checkly CLI to test your preview environments and then transform your tests into monitoring once you deploy to production. And again, if you want to access this source code of these GitHub actions, the code is right in the description below. And that's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comments if this was useful, if you want to have other guides around CI/CD, monitoring as code, or how to implement Checkly in your project. Let me know. I'm very happy to record more videos. And if you want to get in touch with me or the Checkly crew, make sure to join the Checkly community Slack at checklyhq.com/Slack. I promise we're a lovely bunch, and I will see you very soon again for the next Checkly synthetic monitoring or playwright tip.